Well, thank you for that graceful introduction, Vince. I've been on enough college campuses in my life in all kinds of different ways over the course of years to know that 4 o'clock on an afternoon is a big, big deal. So it's impressive to me that you came. Thank you for being here today. What's next? Living into a faith that shapes a vocation, that shapes a culture. You see, I want a meaningful job. I want a meaningful life. I want to have meaningful work. This came out of a conversation with a very dear friend of mine who's the CEO of a company in Kansas City. And a couple of years ago, he called me one night and said, "Steve, could we do one thing together? Just this thing. If we could do this thing, I'd be happy, really." He says, "I probably once a month have some mother or father in Kansas City call me and say, 'Would you have lunch with my son? He just graduated from the University of, my daughter just finished at the University of, if she could just talk with you before she goes off to Chicago to get her big job, it'd be a great boost, really, for the rest of her life." And my friend is a very good man, a very generous man, a very kind man, a very thoughtful man. And he always tries to say yes to these requests. And month by month, he's sitting down for lunch with one of these 21, 22-year-olds who've just finished undergraduate years. And they're sitting over the lunch, and David, my friend, is asking questions about, what you've been doing, what you've been studying, what do you want to do with your life? And eventually he says it always comes down to a conversation like this. They say back to him, "Well, you see, I want a meaningful life, and that's why I'm looking for work in the nonprofit sector." And my friend asked me, says, "Couldn't we work on this, Steve? Couldn't we somehow try to address this, really?" Because he has no axis to grind, he's not a tender-hearted person in the sense of he gets offended by this, but it's an ironic moment, you have to agree, because here he is, a CEO of an international corporation. I would guess probably most of you in this room own something his company has produced. It's all over the world, really. And he thinks to himself, well, you see, what they're saying, obviously, is that what I do isn't very meaningful. Maybe it's not meaningful at all, because you see, sadly, I have to make money. I do make money. And of course, where all the meaning in life is found is in the nonprofit sector. Maybe 10 years ago, the Lilly Endowment created a very large grant. They gave $2 million grants to 90 institutions across the country. There were Catholics and Calvinists and Baptists and Lutherans and Methodists and Anabaptists, and really from Notre Dame to Duke and Davidson and Calvin and lots of other schools where they got these $2 million grants. They called the program, the program in the exploration of programs in the theological exploration of vocation, PTEV. You had to apply for the grants, and some schools got them, and basically the idea was to let the Anabaptist schools nurture a vision of vocation within that tradition for their students. The Catholic students at Notre Dame to do the same thing, and on and on and on. I had a call eventually from the Lilly Endowment asking if I had any ideas about this, because I've been working on some of these things for a long time. And I told them I had one idea, and the idea was this, that actually the years after college were harder years. They're more difficult years. That's a great gift you've given undergraduate students, time to reflect upon what it means to be a Calvinist or a Catholic and to think about the vision of vocation within that particular tradition. But the years after you leave those undergraduate studies are harder years. I took up Machiavelli's Realpolitik for a moment, and I said, you see, when somebody finishes 4 years of thinking about life and learning and anticipates going off into the rest of life and imagines a vocation to pursue for my life, to give meaning and shape to my life, well, I said, when they meet Machiavelli in the marketplace, it's awfully hard, actually, because Machiavelli will have gotten there first. And he may offer you a job, but a vocation, that'll be a lot harder to find, actually. Then I turned Machiavelli on his head a little bit, and I said, but even worse than that is that they'll meet real ecclesiastique, not just realpolitik, but real ecclesiastique. And you funded schools with particular ecclesial traditions, all these various ones across the country, 90 of them. In a sense, you already have bought into the assumption that the church matters in America, that has something to do with the health of American life. And you funded these schools to nurture that vision for graduates of these institutions. But if they can't find a Catholic parish after graduating from Notre Dame University once they move to Chicago, It'll be awfully hard to imagine keeping this vision of vocation alive beyond the age 25, 26, 27. Because we look back on 21, being 21, thinking, a lot of ivory tower conversations you have when you're 21. And this vocation one surely was that, because neither the world nor the church thinks this way. The assumption behind the $200 million grant was simple, even if profound. There's an integral relationship between education and vocation. That the way learning goes, life goes. To underscore this belief, from the pages of yesterday's New York Times, maybe you saw Thomas Friedman's essay, his op-ed piece, Comes the Revolution. It doesn't go on for very long. You could read it pretty easily, actually. But he describes a group of Stanford University professors who have decided to create a new course that they're offering all over the world. And they now have something like 1 million students signed up for these courses. The idea is to take the refinements and loves and insights of Stanford professors and offer them to people in every corner of the earth. Here's how Friedman put it yesterday. When you consider how many problems around the world are attributable to the lack of education, that's very good news. Let the revolution begin. Again, this idea that somehow there's a relationship, an integral relationship between education and vocation. I want to set this before you in several different ways. One question, 2 temptations, 3 stories, and then we'll come to an end. But each time I'm going to set forth a challenge for us, and then a response to that challenge. So, first of all, one question. I've been asking this really for most of the years of my life with students. Do you have a telos that is sufficient to meaningfully orient your praxis over the course of life? Maybe that seems like an awful lot on Monday afternoon. But how about more simply put, why do you get up in the morning? Why do you get up in the morning? Do you have a reason that takes you beyond having donuts on Monday morning in the cafeteria? Somehow I have to get there before the bell rings. I mean, what is it that actually gets a person out of bed in the morning? Telos and praxis are the more complex words, of course, aren't they? Telos is this idea that I live my life for an end, a particular end. I'm looking at a particular point to my life, and I orient my life towards that point. The Westminster Catechism, centuries ago, put it this way in their very first question. What is man's chief end? It was a telos question, wasn't it? A telos question. Do you have a telos that is sufficient to meaningfully orient your praxis, the way you live your life, how you work your life out over the course of life? Think about it. Do I have something which I say matters most to me, that it gives substance to my life, coherence to my life, that somehow can orient my life over the course of my life? I spent some years dropped out of college a long time ago. And one of the guys I met in those years was an Indian philosopher named Surendra Gangadine. He even sounds Indian, doesn't he? But he was, and I spent some months of my life thinking and working with him and asking questions and trying to understand his vision and his work. But he put a question to me, or he put this thesis out to me, and I've thought it was true then, I think it's still true now. Expectation affects program. Expectation affects program. What he was arguing was something eschatological, to put it in theological terms. That what we expect about the future is going to shape the way we live our life today. If our vision is of a utopia, and you can imagine various utopians over the course of centuries and millennia, well, you see, that will affect what you do today with your life. Things you work at, things you prize, what means the most to you and what means less to you. But the idea that somehow my expectation about the future shapes the way that I live my life today. It affects my program. I think it's awfully hard, actually, to put this telos praxis business together in life, to do it in a coherent way. In almost, thousands and thousands of ways, the pressures to compartmentalize about our lives are intense. To say that, in fact, I think this matters. This matters most to me. I care most about this, you see. But in fact, to see it get worked out in ways which really have very little relationship to what a person says, this is what is most important in my life. This is my chief end in Westminster Catechism terms. How do we keep our visions and vocations alive over time? I could say 1,000 things here, really, but I'm going to say one thing. I think you need to choose your neighbors well. Choose your neighbors well. My wife and I have made this a point in our life since the beginning of our life together 35 years ago. We took these words from the Clapham community in England 200 years ago, the community that banded around Wilberforce to work for the abolition of the slave trade in 18th century England. But they argued that you should choose a neighbor before you choose a house. Hear it again. Choose a neighbor before you choose a house. And in flawed ways and fumbling ways, my wife and I have made that choice again and again and again. Where we live now for the last 20 years, we made that choice here as well. And every Wednesday morning I meet with some folks who have made that same choice to live life out together, to work at things together, to think about things together. We talk, we think, we pray, we celebrate holidays together, we have birthdays together. They work in the things of Washington, D.C. Somebody does this, and somebody else does this, and somebody's in Israel this week, and somebody's in New York City last week. And we live a life like that because, you see, we think it's too hard otherwise. If you don't choose a neighbor before you choose a house, it's very hard to keep the things you say that matter most to you alive in your heart. Really alive in the way you live your life. More than simply creedal, yes, I believe in that. That's important to me. But you see, in the push come to shove 7 days a week, month after month, year after year, how are you going to keep alive the things you say matter most to you? I think you need to choose your neighbors well. Well, there are two temptations to this question of what's next and living a life out over the course of life. Hear these words: hubris, humility; injustice, justice; despair, hope; cowardice, courage; hate, love. Vices are always virtues that are twisted. Vices are always virtues that are twisted. It helps us to put it in these terms, that the word vice stands in relation to the word virtuous, as the word virtue stands in relation to the word virtuous, as the word vice does to the word vicious. Vicious. And when you put the word vicious into this equation, you realize we've ratcheted this up quite a bit, haven't we? Because what's vicious mean? It destroys, it hurts, it's out to wound. It's out to make something which was alive dead. And so virtues are always what was meant to be. Vices are the twisting of virtues. Temptations are always good gifts that are skewed, not ivory tower movements, but in the hours and days of your heart and mine. For example, what's it mean to know? What does it mean to know? That question is woven into the fabric of every human heart. This past week or so, we've had these horrible, perplexing stories from Lance Armstrong and Monty Teo, haven't we? If you pay attention at all to sports in America, you think, what was going on here? What did you do? How'd this happen? You knew what, Lance Armstrong, and you did what? You said what? And you hurt how many people? And you knew that, and you knew it was wrong, and you knew it was a lie, and of course the perplexing story of Monty Teo at Notre Dame, and you think, I could read every day a new story, and I still would not understand what happened, really. I mean, it's just such a weird story, really. But somebody knew something, and we're all wondering, well, what did you know, and when did you know it? Because you see, if you can figure out what you knew, then maybe you can figure out whether you're responsible or not. A couple of days ago, Hillary Clinton was before the Senate, and she was being grilled, whether you liked it or not, whether you're for it or against it. I mean, it's not really the point here so much. But the big question about Benghazi was, so what did you know? When did you know it? Because you see, if we can figure out what you knew and when you knew it, then maybe we can figure out whether you're responsible or not. It is for everyone everywhere, for roommates and for friends, for judges and for courts, for beltways and back roads of your city and mine. But if you knew, why didn't you do? We expect that there is a responsibility for knowledge, that we are implicated in what we know, by what we know. The two great temptations with this assumption about knowledge are Stoicism and cynicism. Stoicism and cynicism. Stoics, of course, turn the barometer of the heart down because you don't want to have to feel too much, do you? If I said about one of my friends in this room, you see, it's a sad thing, my friend Dwight over there, such a stoic, isn't he, really? Well, we're saying about Dwight that somehow, in some way, for some reason, he's chosen not to be responsive, to turn the barometer down because he doesn't want to have to feel so much. And why wouldn't you want to have to feel so much? Well, you see, the Stoics, a long time ago, millennia ago, human beings as they are, as they were, offered apatheia as the chief end. So rather than to glorify God and enjoy Him forever, as the Westminster Divines put it, the Stoics said, no, it's apatheia, you see. We don't have a word like apatheia in our language today. But apatheia for them was no pejorative word. It had no negative meaning at all. Apatheia was the very point of life. That's why you lived your life. That you would know, but you wouldn't respond in a way that got you hurt again. And why? Because, of course, you wanted to hold on to your happiness as a human being. That really was the point, to be happy, to be a happy person. And why would you know about things that would cause you to be drawn into them that would hurt you, that would complicate things for you, that would mess things up for you? I really do think that there are a lot of good reasons to be a Stoic, actually. And why is that? Because there's just an awful lot of brokenness in this world. There's a lot of hurt in this world. There's a lot of misery in this world. It's easy to go see Les Miserables. It's harder when you actually translate it from French to English and say, the miserables. And have to think through what the social, economic, political conditions of people are in this world. Broken, complex as it is. There's a lot of good reasons, I would say, to be a Stoic. Cynics, on the other hand, are almost as old historically as Stoics are. But a cynic, if somebody lives in my city of Washington, D.C., don't they? It's the cynic city, isn't it, really? Except somehow it was also the Roman Greek capital cities, too. And for every city like that in the history of the world, we've always had the ability to say, oh, come on now, I'm not going to be stupid like that. I'm not going to get fooled again. I'm not 21 anymore, come on. I've lived my life a little bit, you see. I know it isn't like that for anybody, really, anywhere. So you better get yours. Cynicism, of course, has different faces along the way. But you see, both cynicism and Stoicism allow us to protect our hearts from the implications of what we know. That's the point, isn't it? If Romans 1 is the prism upon all of our hearts, all of our lives, and Romans 1 says, you see, all that needs to be known is there to be known. In fact, it's so clearly known that we are without excuse. But as Paul puts it, we suppress, we repress what we know to be true. Why? Because we don't want to have to be responsible for what we know to be true. That's the theological dynamic there that works its way out in your heart and mine. Both are long-developed and deeply held responses to the most perennial of all questions. What will you do with what you know? Rippling out from the primordial temptation of Genesis 3, both are ways to protect our hearts from the implications of what we know. But there's another way to know, you see. We're not just stuck there. For me, I'd start with the Hebrew vision of knowledge. It's a simple four-letter word as we have it in Hebrew, and it comes into our English. It's yada, yada. And if you were to listen to it from Genesis to Malachi, it comes out something pretty close to this. That when you have knowledge of, you have responsibility to, which means you have care for. Hear it again. When you have knowledge of, it means you have responsibility to. It means you have care for. It makes sense, of course, of in its own perplexing, complex way, this oddly but importantly named tree, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. It makes sense, of course, a few chapters later of Adam knew Eve, his wife. It makes sense in Exodus chapter 1. There came a Pharaoh who knew not Joseph. It makes sense in book upon book, all the way through the Old Testament Revelation. In the Proverbs, which says, a righteous man cares about justice for the poor, but the wicked have no such concern. It's the same Hebrew word, yada. It's used there in Genesis 1. It's a rich, complex word, a very important word. But to have knowledge of means you have responsibility to, means you have care for. So you see, if you know, then you care. If you don't care, then you don't really know. In the conversations that matter about things like this, I'm very glad to say, you see, I am a Hebrew Christian. I think about the world in the light of the Hebrew and Christian visions of reality. Because I want to honor this base, this grounding, which comes to us in this Old Covenant, Old Testament revelation. Because there's no way to make sense of what Jesus does when he is the Word made flesh in the Gospels, apart from seeing him as fully holy, fully godly, fully divine, but also fully Hebrew and human. So if it's to know means to care, and if we do not care, then we do not know in the Old Testament. In the New Testament, it's simply to know means to love. To know means to love. We could spend hours on this. We don't have that much time here today. Take the story in the Gospels. We call it the Good Samaritan. It's a good story for academics, isn't it? For an academic world. Because you see, the very first word of that story begins with, he was an academic expert. He had mastered his discipline. He knew everything. You see, he was an expert in the law, is how the text puts it to us. There's no sense he was actually asking an honest question, wanting an honest answer. Because he asked a question which Jesus does not want to respond to. And they go back and forth for a while, and then finally, in 21st century vernacular, the expert in the law wants to deconstruct the word neighbor, doesn't he? He wants to abstract it, to take it outside of any kind of context for life, labor, love. He just says, so what is a neighbor anyway, actually? How do we define the word neighbor? Jesus says, I won't go there with you. I will tell you the story, though. If the contemporary novelist Walker Percy was telling this story, he would call it the story of the man who got all A's and who flunked life. But the story is like this one, isn't it? It's about two men much like the expert in the law who, on their way to Jericho, decide to go through this passageway through the mountains. If you've ever been from Jerusalem to Jericho, you know just what that looks like, really. And they see a beaten up man, a bruised man. They don't stop to pick him up, though, because he's not a neighbor after all. For historical and theological and sociological reasons, he's not a neighbor, you see. They define their own discipleship. They define their own life in ways which don't have to deal with this beaten, bruised man. The scandal of the story is that a Samaritan walks by for no good reasons, historically, theologically, sociologically, except that he sees a neighbor. And he stops and picks him up and takes him to the inn, and it's not a very long story after all. And Jesus says to the expert, so who was the neighbor? You can't really read this story that Jesus offers to us in all the stories of the Gospels as they come to us from Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, without hearing them again and again, giving us a window into this reality that in the Hebrew and Christian vision of knowing, when you know, you care. When you know, you love. If you don't care, then you don't know. If you don't love, then you don't know. Well, 3 stories. These are equal opportunity stories, really. 1 nonprofit and 2 for-profit stories. But there's no privilege of place here. There's no hierarchy at all. All the stories matter. If Machiavelli offered us realpolitik, it was Lord Bismarck who said in Germany a century and a half ago, if you want to respect sausage or law, then don't watch either being made, okay? I think about these words almost every week, at least, in my life. I've been doing this for a long time, doing what I do in Washington, D.C., thinking, if you want to respect sausage or law, then don't watch either being made. I don't think it is cynicism, as I've listened to this and thought it through, we could talk about that. I think there's a hard-won realism about it. Because you see, if you're going to stick with the vocation of politics, of public responsibility in some way like that, then you're going to have to somehow make peace with Lord Bismarck's insight, his argument, that it's a messy, messy, messy business. I have a friend who actually literally makes sausage. Well, he grinds up ground meat and makes them as hamburgers. And the sign in his story is that burgers, the way they were meant to be. It's pretty nice, actually. He calls the business Elevation Burger. Elevation Burger. His name is Hans, and Hans was chairman of our board for quite a few years. He's sold about 180 franchises all over the world now of Elevation Burger. His tagline is that ingredients matter. Ingredients matter. You could choose otherwise, and it's okay, really, but when you get to be my age in life, you can't actually eat Five Guys hamburgers anymore. It's just the way it works, really. And I tried a few years ago, and I thought, why do this to myself? I'm not sleeping for hours and hours. I'm not even going to bed. I can't sleep. My stomach is so upset, really, because they put all that stupid stuff in my body again from Five Guys hamburgers, really. It isn't really meant to be eaten by human beings. I'm sorry to tell you that. But when you're 20, it doesn't seem to count, really, and you can keep doing it for a while, but you can't keep doing it when you get to be my age, frankly. It just doesn't work anymore. What I noticed that going to my friend Hans's hamburger place, where ingredients matter, where actually the cows are healthy cows that he kills, and the French fries are fried in olive oil, interestingly, which actually we do better with as human beings in our stomachs. But I could go have lunch with somebody at Hans's Elevation Burger, and I could come back to my office and not think about it all afternoon, actually. It's a strange thing, really, that he makes burgers and fries this way. It isn't a fancy pants place. It isn't a gourmet burger. It really is a place for moms to bring their little kids. You know why? Because they think, I'll get them some good food. And it's sort of quick, but it's not like a fast food, but it's almost fast. But it's healthy food. And a lot of moms these days care about healthy foods for their kids. And even people like me do, for my stomach as well. I tease Hans, though. I ask him, so Hans, when are you going to learn to make a Christian hamburger? There are a lot of people actually who go to church who want to buy Christian things, don't they? They have Christian yellow pages, and they want to buy Christian this and Christian that and Christian this over here. And I say, well, Hans, you went to Dallas Theological Seminary of all things. You surely should understand that you need to make this burger and this burger and this burger, and then finally on the same list there ought to be a holy hamburger, I think, at least, probably, for those of us who really need to eat Christian things. Well, he smiles back at me, and I tease him that he's probably back there behind the screen putting cross-shaped Elevation sauce on the burgers. We don't even know it, and we are anyway. But I push him even further, and I say, Hans, you know what you're doing, of course, is you're making eschatological hamburgers. How's that one, huh? Eschatological hamburgers. If you don't know eschatology, let me just invite you to ask Dr. Christopher Mitchell here at the Wade Center to introduce you to a wonderful, wonderful, best eschatological story ever by anybody. It's called Leaf by Niggle by J.R.R. Tolkien. And if you don't know this story, don't let this day be done without at least downloading it on a PDF and read it before you go to bed tonight. It takes about a half an hour. It isn't very long, really. But it is eschatology at its very, very best, actually. And it makes sense of my friend Hans's hamburgers. Because I say to him, well, Hans, Jesus could have chosen any metaphor in the whole world, couldn't he? But he chose eating at a table for us to hold on to between times. And he said, well, on this last night before I die, here's a table. We're going to eat together. And you know what? Until I come again, meet at a table week after week after week. And then the next thing, when it's all over and the consummation has finally completely happened, and the marriage supper of the Lamb is finally in place, it'll be a marriage supper of the Lamb after all. And so for you to make eschatological hamburgers here, well, it's a pretty good deal really, because it's a little signpost of what will be someday all we eat. Because you see, we won't always eat Five Guys, I'm just sorry to tell you that, because it'll be always healthy, always tasty at the same time, no trade-off. Always healthy, always tasty at the same time. Everything on the marriage supper of the Lamb table will be healthy and tasty at the same time. My friend Hans is trying to make hamburgers and French fries They had a little signpost of the way that the world someday will be. I have a young friend. She's no longer as young as she used to be, but she used to be a college student like some of you are here. I met her when she was about 20, 21 years old. I spoke at a conference in Phoenix, Arizona, and her professors from Whitworth College brought her down for this event. And we talked afterwards, and I was impressed with her. I wrote her name down, and I remembered a few weeks later when I was at home, and I got a call from some guys who have played music together for quite a while. They call themselves the Jars of Clay. They said, Steve, we want to do something for Africa. We think we ought to. We think we care about this. We have ideas for it, but we don't know what to do with it, really. And they were on their bus going up the West Coast doing concerts, and I offered them Jenna Lee, who was a senior at Whitworth College at the time. I said, I met this young girl a few weeks ago, and she's very bright, very passionate. She's been to Africa a few times. She would be very cheap, actually. She would move to Nashville maybe even, and she'd help you get this thing going, and who knows, really. And they were doing a concert in Spokane a couple of weeks later. They met Jenna, and they talked to her, and she wrote a 25-page paper before Christmas, gave it to them. This is how I would address the need for clean blood and clean water in Africa. She gave the graduation speech that spring at Whitworth as a student chosen to do that, and then she moved to Nashville. And Dwight and I actually sat in the Frothy Monkey in Nashville one time with her in the fall. And she was just crying, really, and she was wanting, and it was very, very hard, because how are you going to do something that matters with such complexity as that? And she was 22. These guys played guitars. That was their complaint. We play guitars. We can't address this, really. But you know what? There were some hard discussions, and there was some hard work, and we had a whole day with pencils and papers and erasing and crossing out and working at it again, and finally we decided, let's try this, really. Let's try this, really. Well, about 10 years later, is it 10 years now? Almost 10 years later, they worked to give away millions of dollars a year in about 25 different countries in Africa. It's called the Blood Water Mission. Maybe you know it, really. But they addressed this complexity of the need for clean blood and clean water in Africa. To pick up the Wade Center again, I think one of the most truthful, profound, epistemological moments in all of Lewis's literature is when he says in the mouth of Aslan in the last battle to these Pevensey kids who are sure they finally have gotten there, and he says, no, no, further up and further in, further up and further in. And the way I live my life really is like that. I don't know how else to live it, frankly. Where you in some sense have a vision, have a telos, you're trying to orient your praxis around the telos coherently, consistently, thoughtfully, in a way which honors God and the world. It's hard to do that, but as I listen to Aslan say again and again, further up and further in, because you see, 8 years later, after lots of successes with Bloodwater Mission, Jenna told me a year or so ago, she said, Steve, I've been listening to you talk about this idea of knowing and loving the world for a long time in my life. But you know what? Now I really know Africa, and it's really hard. It isn't very easy at all. It's very, very complicated. We meet people who don't treat us fairly. They lie to us. They cheat. The money gets stolen. And he says, the more work we do, the more complex it seems to me it gets, really. If it's sausage making for my friend Hans, it's the inside of Wendell Berry for Jenna Lee, who says hope is hard, especially when you get older. The longer you live your life, it's harder to hope because it's more difficult. There's more complexity. There's more pain. It just gets worse and it gets messier. And how will you be somebody of faith and hope and love in the midst of a world that gets harder and harder to work at? Well, that's what I work at in my life with Jenna and a lot of other people, really. I've thought about some resources for her, and maybe for you too. But on the one hand, the classic Pilgrim's Progress is a book you should not finish Wheaton College without having read and taken it to heart, really. It's a good book. It's one of the best books. It's a book which would shape your soul for the rest of your life, really. But you could also take Cormac McCarthy's The Road and hold these two books together, perhaps. And this story of a father and a son making their way through a devastated end of the world. Could we somehow, in the midst of the worst thing we've never even imagined, as we look around us, could we somehow love each other and love the world? Well, the third story I would call the task of translation. The task of translation. It's a story of my friend Jay. A pastor in Washington, D.C. some years ago wrote me a note one day and said, "Steve, would you meet with this guy? He came to see me in my office this week, and he's beginning to think that if Christianity really is true, it ought to have meaning for his life. It ought to have consequence for what he does with his life." At that point, in the post-9/11 world, he was had a very weighty position in the national security world, which he did for a while. And then, with a big smile on my face, I'll say to you, he makes M&Ms now. He works for the Mars Corporation, which is headquartered in McLean, Virginia. In the strangest of life, this global, iconic, M&M manufacturer, there isn't even a sign on the building of their global headquarters, strangely. We could talk about that if you wanted to. But once you walk in, it's a cornucopia of Skittles and M&Ms and Dove ice cream bars and the whole thing, really. It's all there to be eaten, really. But Jay now keeps the world safe for M&Ms, is how I put it to him. And I think he likes that. No longer national defense, national security, but the world safe for M&Ms, with his DPhil from Oxford and all sorts of things like that. But you know what? M&Ms are made by the Mars family, the Mars Corporation. It's about maybe 90,000 employees globally, maybe 2 million people in the supply chain globally, maybe $35, $40 billion a year sales. It's a big deal what they do, relatively speaking at least. And the Mars family who own this, it's a privately held corporation. This is all, you could read this, I'm not telling you any new stories here. But the Mars family makes no profession of faith. It isn't as if somehow the longer aim here is to make Christian M&Ms. So if you're a Christian working for the Mars company, that maybe your point two would be to make ichthus stamped M&Ms, for all of us. It probably will have a little M on it forever and ever and ever, actually. But Jay introduced me to his colleague, Bruno, in the first few months of his employment there. We had breakfast at a restaurant in the area and talked and talked and talked. And Bruno was a Frenchman. He's the chief economist for the Mars Corporation. And we got talking about what he called, he said, we need a more complex bottom line. This was about 1.5 years before the financial markets imploded, about 5 years ago. So think about where you were then, about 1.5 years before all that happened. And Bruno put it this way, he said, if all we ask of an economy or of a business is that it maximize shareholder profit for that quarter, it isn't a big enough question to ask. Other questions have to be asked too. And so I said, well, like what, Bruno? He said, well, I've been thinking about the idea of Jubilee for a long time, actually. This idea of God ordering the way human beings ought to live in the world. And he says, I know it's not the Old Testament, and we're living in France and America, but he said, I've been thinking about what it would look like to try to work out in a globalizing political economy in the 21st century, this vision of Jubilee. For a company that makes no profession of faith, again, I want to underscore that. This is not for a Christian company, really. So we began talking and talking and talking about all that, really. I've asked rock musicians that I've gotten to know over the last numbers of years this question sometimes. Can you sing songs shaped by the truest truths of the universe, but in language the whole world can understand? Ask it again. Can you sing songs shaped by the truest truths of the universe, but in language the whole world can understand? I could play music up here to you for your hours right now. I could offer you Mumford & Sons right now, and some of you would really like that a lot, Strangely, amazingly, this group of guys from Holy Trinity Brompton Church in London, who actually love God and want to serve God in the world, have found a way to be poets for the whole world right now, singing songs shaped by the truest truths of the universe, but in language the whole world can understand. U2's been doing that for 25 or 30 years now, really. Sometimes people find a way to do that. I think it's a good question for people in the business world too. Can you somehow imagine a way to do business that's shaped by the truest truths of the universe, but in language the whole world can understand? Because you see, if Bruno and Jay are taken by this biblical vision of the way economic life ought to look like in the world, and find something about the vision of Jubilee in the Old Testament to give words for that. There's no way under the sun that a company like Mars is going to buy in and say, well, we want to do this because God says it, really. Most of you people will be people who work for people who don't believe in the Nicene Creed. What will you do then? How will you work out your faith in a pluralizing, secularizing, globalizing world? That's what my friends at the Mars Corporation are trying to work out. How do you work out fidelity to God, fidelity to the Scriptures, in a way which means something to history? I took them down to meet a man named Wendell Berry a few summers ago for a day-long conversation. Some of you might know his work. But after a whole day of discussion, he said to us this. He said, you know, if you want to make money for 1 year, you're going to ask certain questions, aren't you? But you want to make money for 100 years, you're going to have to ask other questions. That was a pretty good word, actually. And so my friends who were trying to rethink the way business works in the world, I think it's the task of translation they've taken up, of trying to give meaning and words and ideas which somehow find their home in a school like Wheaton College, but have to somehow be made sense of at the Paris School of Economics. Or last week it was at Oxford University, because Oxford wants to take up this idea these guys are working at and give academic home to it. Like Milton Friedman had a home at Chicago, well, Oxford offered this project a home in the Saïd Business School, trying to give rigor, weight, longevity to people trying to rethink the way business ought to be done in the world. Well, each person's a window into work well done, to the glory of God and service to the world. You see, each is a story of a discipline mastered, an area of life and learning that's been critically and carefully engaged. Each is a story of someone learning to learn about a part of God's world and doing the hard, good work of finding their place in it. Each is a story of an education that's become a vocation, of the integral providential connection between education and vocation. All are windows into the task of translation, as each is someone who believes deeply in the truest truths of the universe, but is finding language to sing their song in economics, in international development, in music itself, that the whole world can understand. All are windows into our common calling, whether we are butchers, bakers, candlestick makers, whether we make hamburgers or M&Ms, or address the complexity of HIV and AIDS. Each one of us is called to be common grace for the common good. That's a vision of flourishing for everyone, everywhere. And so each is a window into a way of making sense of life, of God, of the human condition, of history, that is becoming a life, that's having consequence for life. Each has decided to step into history, into the way the world turns out, into the messiness and the hurt, the longings and the hopes that are the contours of your life and mine. In fact, the lives of every man and every woman. Simply said, each is a window into a faith that is shaping a vocation, that is shaping a culture. Amen. We have some time for questions if you have any. So we'll be done by a good time here. Yes, who are you?
My name is Craig Miller. First, I want to say thank you so much for your presentation. I'm going back to your initial question of how can our vision, our telos, orient our praxis, and the one response you said of choosing your neighbors well. Can you just address, in your perspective, what is the impact of the technological society that we live in? How does that impact forming community?
Uh-huh. Yeah. It's ironic, isn't it? When I fly out of Washington, D.C. this morning, I have to get x-rayed. Why? Because they know me, and I might hurt them. Yeah. It's a strange thing. The more we know of each other, the less sure we are of each other. The more we know of each other, the more afraid we are of each other. It's a strange dynamic of the information age, isn't it? That the more knowledge means the more fearful we are. It's I, for several years, was very, very suspicious of Facebook. I just thought, this is the stupidest thing in the world, really. My kids were doing this, and I was thinking, oh, come on, really. And my wife did it to watch my kids' lives, really. And then I would look at her Facebook, and I think sometimes, like, that's kind of interesting, huh? I didn't know that about so-and-so, really. And about a year and a half later, I thought, I think I'm going to try this, maybe, really. Now, I have to say to you that I have, without being really stupid about it, I hope I'm not being stupid about it, I do have a sense of redeeming Facebook in my life. So you won't find much at all about whether I had soup for lunch today or a salad for lunch today. It was chicken noodle soup, by the way. It was not on Facebook. But I have found it to be a place where I'm able to engage people I wouldn't necessarily engage in other ways. And I've come to call Facebook as some place that has strange graces. Strange graces. I teach a course twice every year for people in Washington. It's called the Fellows Initiative. People come from Wheaton's and schools all over the country like Wheaton, but into Washington for a year. It's a 9-month-long program. It's called the Fellows Program, the Fellows Initiative. And I teach a course I call Learning to Read the Word and to Read the World at the Same Time. And 2 of the books I require, out of the 10 books I require for the semester, one is the book called The Shallows by Nicholas Carr. Another book is by Eugene Peterson called Eat This Book. And I'm wanting these 22, 23-year-olds to think about these 2 books together, because Carr is the latest in 25 years of books beginning with Postman's Amusing Ourselves to Death, all the way up. We could walk through many books, which are all good books in their own different ways. But the most recent is called The Shallows by Nicholas Carr, which was an Atlantic Monthly cover story several summers ago. He makes it a hard argument, people, especially if you're more on the younger side of this crowd today. He's not a Luddite. He's not asking we should all move back into some other era. We didn't have iPhones and Google searches and things like that. He's not talking about that. But he is saying that the way we learn to learn with a computer screen being the primary mediator, our brains are actually being rewired right now. Now, you may not have noticed that last week, but his argument's a pretty serious one, really. That actually the way we see things is changing in the early 21st century because of the primary medium we have for learning about anything is a computer screen where we can click our way through and we can score our way through, and we're not really looking for the detailed, more thoughtful argument. We want to know more and more. I've had a thesis for most of my life now that was captured in these words. The artists get there first. And so about 20 years ago now, U2 wrote a song called Numb. If you haven't seen it yet, then go home and watch it on YouTube, okay? Numb. Actually, The Edge, one of the members of the band, wrote this particular song. And it really features him in almost kind of an odd presentation of a song, but basically what it is that he is offered every temptation and allurement and blessing and happy and awful thing in the world. In some, of course. It's beautiful girls wanting to kiss him. It's people wanting to strangle him. Girls wanting to offer him a lollipop to lick. It's people wanting to blow smoke in his face. All kinds of things. He is just looking straight ahead, though, like he's staring at you. Like, it's kind of awkward. He's just staring at you the whole time. And then about halfway through, Bon and the rest of the band began to sing, I feel numb, I feel numb, I feel numb, I feel numb, I feel numb. Too much is not enough, I feel numb. You have to watch it a few times to understand it, I think. But what The Edge is doing is looking at a TV screen, actually. Never seen on the video. But there's this flickering translucence that's always there. And he will not be unplugged. That's the point. And so when Bono and the rest of the band began to sing, too much is not enough, well, you think about what it means to live on your iPhone today, or to check your stuff today, tonight, this morning, in the middle of the night. It is my temptation like it is yours. Too much is not enough. Why? I want more. I'd like more emails not to respond to my inbox, thank you. We could talk about it for a long time, but it's a very good question. Yeah. And who are you?
Alex. I just have a question. So, and this is related to the idea of telos. So there's Dr. James Smith. He's a professor of philosophy at Calvin College. And he talks about how, basically in one of his books, Desiring the Kingdom, he talks about how he basically refutes the idea of atheism. He's saying, like, even secular institutions, so he uses the mall, for example. He says it's a liturgical experience. And so what he's talking about is, like, there's an underlying, like, end, or there's an underlying purpose to why you're doing something. And in that context, I feel like within American culture, for example, like, it's a very consumeristic culture where it's everything, you're looking at everything from a cost-benefit analysis, which is really in contrast to the values of the kingdom. And so, like, what you're talking about, just about community, I feel like a lot of what the church is doing, what we're being called to do, these are all very, like, scripture, it's very theoretical. And so, like, it's not effective like these others. So he says, like, yeah, going to the mall, going to, like, watching a sports game, for example, like, it's a formative experience. It transforms, like, it works on your heart, your affections. My question is, like, especially in an environment like where you're at, like in Washington, for example, what are some examples of, I guess, like, liturgical or worship, like, experiences, just like as a Christian, practices that you could do that kind of keep you grounded in the sense that it's like, so you're being in the world without being of the world, if that makes sense.
Yeah. They're probably small and large, and probably this is better for a walk across campus with you, just talk it through more fully. But I would say, in the smallest liturgical expression is my Wednesday morning meeting with these neighbors of mine, where we've actually chosen to live a life together. So we know what's going on week by week in each other's lives. We talk things through. We listen to each other. It's a great gift to listen to somebody, frankly. Oftentimes we don't have anybody who really listens very carefully to us. So for somebody to say, I'd like to know, and what about this part of it then? And what would this look like if this happened then? Those are more important questions to ask of each other. In wider families, we do, as I said, we do have, over the course of the year, we've chosen to meet together when we can do that, and we have celebrations and holidays together, and all of us are part of churches where we take worship seriously, and I'm a great student of Leslie Newbegin's, who put it this way in a book called The Gospel in a Pluralist Society. The last chapter in the book was one titled, strangely, The Congregation as the Hermeneutic of the Gospel. And when I first read it, I didn't like it really at all. I wanted a bigger thing than that. I just thought, this is way too small, Dr. Newbegin. Ugh. This grand critique of the world and the meaning of the gospel and the culture and the local church is please, I remember thinking this is like the mouse that roared, really. But I was too young and he was wiser than I was, really. I think that really is critical. I don't think people can actually have coherent lives without something like that. We could tease this out more fully, really, in terms of participation in the city. There's always this business of how will you really be in, but not of. How do you know what civil religion is and keep your heart away from it? But how do you be a citizen at the same time and take part in things that are important for all of us? Those are tricky things to work out. They are things which you have to work out probably in community, people who can push you and shove you and make you be honest with yourself. It's a good question. More to say. Yes, and who are you?
My name is Garber Smith. That's just on your point of how when you get older it becomes harder to hope. It's easier to become jaded and to become a cynic and to see everything that's dark in the world. Or as we become more aware of evil, it is easier to fear and harder to have faith. When do you find most that, like, just that blitheness or that ignorant blissfulness of childhood is present? And as time marches on, and it's just such confusion.
I mean, we're all different people, and all the stories are different stories, aren't they? Some little people, tragically, don't have any much time like that in their lives at all, and those are stories to be grieved over, really. I think, culturally speaking, we mostly will say that there is this time between adolescence and adulthood, which, for many people, seems a time of more possibility. More things might be done. I could do this. I'm thinking about this. A place like Wheaton College exists in some ways to offer majors in economics and philosophy and literature, but it also allows you to take some general education courses, kind of find your way in too. Where you're not quite sure really where this is all going to lead me. I think I want to do this, but after a semester, I don't think I really want to do that actually. But you see, in some ways, it's all open still. This is not normative at all, but all three of the stories I told of these people, of Hans, of Jenna, of Jay, all do things now different than they thought they were going to be doing when they were 20 years old. The world seemed this way. I think I could do this. And then over the next 10, 15 years, choices were made, things happened really that took them in other directions than they imagined they were going to be in when they were 20-year-olds. But I would say that for most of us, there is this sense where when you're 19, 20, 21, 22, for many people, not for everybody, for many of us, there's a sense that the world is open to me. What am I going to do in it? How am I going to take up my place in the world? And I think that can be a very good gift, and you can't hold on to it forever because it doesn't last forever. One last question. Yeah. And who are you?
Hi there. My name's Tyler. Thanks for talking to us today. Kind of in light of that, in light of emerging adulthood, where transitions are always happening, people are moving, and possibilities are endless. How would you encourage us to think about choosing our neighbors?
Yeah, that's a good question. It isn't like there's a Mount Sinai revelation here for most of us, at least. It's more people that you know and you love and you care about and you want to be part of. I know for my wife and I, when we first got married, we wanted to be part of a little church community that we had known about that was trying to do some unusual things, some different wineskins, different ways to be a church together. We moved into a neighborhood where people lived near each other. That was the whole point, to live where you could walk to people's houses, and that was very important to us, and that was how we made our first choice as a couple, really. I think when we moved to Washington years later, in one sense that was going to be home for us for our life, but it was hard because that's a big metropolitan area, kind of Chicago-like, and it's kind of like where the city just goes on and on and on and on, really. We had to work really hard at this business of trying to find a neighbor first, choosing a friend who would be a neighbor first, really. But we stumbled a little bit, but we still made that choice when we moved to Washington, and then 3 years later we made a more long-term choice where we've been in this house for 20 years, but I think it has to be people that somehow in the providence of God you have been linked up with, you've been banded together with, people that you have some sense of camaraderie with, people you have some sense of kinship about the kingdom with, or these things matter to you too, they matter to me, they matter to us. I just don't think, my bigger point here, of course, is I think it's really hard to think, I think it's a fantasy actually, to imagine that you can hold on amidst all the pressures of secularizing, globalizing world that it is, that you could really hold on to things you say matter most to you by yourself. You just can't do it. Well, thank you so very much.